Hello, and welcome to AFI Docs 2020, presented by AT&T. My name is Malin, and I'm a programmer with the festival. Before we begin, I just want to thank all of our supporters, particularly our presenting sponsor, AT&T, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, our AFI members, and you, our audience. Thank you so much for watching this year's virtual edition. You should have all have just seen UNLADYLIKE 2020. This is the broadcast hour from an expansive PBS American Masters project, which revisits American history to recognize the accomplishments of lesser known women. And this is such a wonderful and important project, particularly right now in this cultural moment. I am so pleased to have its creator, Charlotte Mangin, here, as well as her co-executive producer, co-director, and writer, Sandra Rattley. Thank you both so much for being here, for taking the time to speak with me, and for including your film in AFI Docs.
Very exciting.
This is really just such a lovely introduction and a sampling from this larger project. I think we should probably begin by just kind of talking about that project and how this special emerged from it.
Absolutely. So UNLADYLIKE 2020 was born several years ago. I took my boys to a museum and we discovered, it was an Air and Space Museum, and we discovered an aviator there named Eleanor Smith, who was the youngest licensed pilot in the world at the time. In the 1920s, at age 16, she got her license. And the men at her airfield didn't believe that, quote, a girl could fly, and they dared her to fly under a bridge. You may know this was the time when barnstorming, all these crazy aerial stunts were all the rage. And I was just so inspired by her story because she ended up flying under all 4 bridges of the East River in New York to really prove herself to these men, and became, broke many endurance records, and became a test pilot. And so I started to research her, and she led me to other aviators, and they led me to women in all these other professions, including the 5 that we're featuring in UNLADYLIKE 2020, the Changemakers. And so the project was conceived as 26 short films. They're 10 minutes long. Each of them is a biography of an unsung woman from the turn of the 20th century who broke barriers in her field. And we've really gone out of our way to present very diverse women from all different professions, racial, ethnic background, geographical origins, socioeconomic origins, and bring these incredible stories back to life. And I'll let Sandy tell you about the hour.
It's very exciting because we're obviously in the year 2020, which is the centennial celebration year for women, the signage of the 19th Amendment and women getting the right to vote. So that was initially our time peg, and looking at what was the status of women 100 years ago. And I think for us, just kind of adding on to what Charlotte said, it's hard to even find the words to describe how awesome and awe-inspiring some of the things that these women did. I mean, when you read the research, when you listen to the interviews, it's kind of like they did what? And even today, when we still talk about glass ceilings and things that women still have to deal with in terms of limitations, whether it is unequal pay, etc., considering the things that women accomplished and had the things that they had almost the nerve to do when the odds against them were even greater. I think it's just absolutely inspiring. And so we're trying to make sure that people understand that these are heroine stories, yes, but they're adventure stories of America, of American history. And it's not just the stories of women, although obviously we're telling the stories of women, but these are stories that everybody should know and everybody should celebrate, because it is what helped to make the fabric of this country. So the 5 women that we're looking at in particular, all of the women, all the 26 women who came out of an original pool of over 200. And so there's a lot of material, but the particular women that we're looking at, we're calling change makers, although all the women we're focusing on have, were instrumental in creating change in some way. But the 5 women we're looking at, the first woman to be elected as a state senator, Martha Hughes Cannon, who's out of Utah; Jeanette Rankin, the first member of Congress; who was elected representing Montana at a time when she was the only woman in Congress with over 400 men. I mean, it's hard to even imagine what that experience was like. Also looking at Yovita Idar, who was a woman out of Laredo, Texas, who was a journalist who also formed the first organization that was a civil rights group for Mexican-American women. Mary Church Terrell, who actually was very active in the city where I live, Washington, D.C., was a founder of the NAACP and was an anti-lynching activist. And then Zikala Sa, also known as Gertrude Bonin, who really fought for sovereignty rights and voting rights for American Indians. So the thing that's interesting about all their stories is their origin stories, of course, the time in which they operated, of course, but that there's a long tail, if you will, on the things that they worked on. Jeanette Rankin, in terms of representation of women in Congress, women are still 23% of our elected officials. So Jeanette Rankin makes a statement saying, I may be the first woman elected in Congress, but I'm not going to be the last. Well, that's true, but we still have a lot of work to do. Jeanette Rankin, of course, holds a special place relative to the suffrage centennial. Mary Church Terrell worked almost all of her life to get a bill passed in the US Congress to outlaw lynching. And so she started this work in the early 1900s, and a bill was finally passed by both sessions of Congress in 2020, which still has not been written into law by the President of the United States. So again, even though we're looking at history, it's just fascinating how these women's stories, what they accomplished 100 years ago, it's still impacting us today. It's still an important part of our national landscape, our political policy issues that are still very relevant today.
Yeah, and thank you so much for, saying all of their names and reminding us of what accomplishments that they made. It's wonderful, of course, to have this project that's surrounding these women's subjects, where you're really kind of going back into history and helping us kind of revisit how it had been written and kind of rewriting it in that wonderful way. But also what is really powerful is to see that there are women kind of at every level of this project. To have women be kind of, yes, to have you two here today, of course. And also, just the choice in having selected basically all women historians to be the kind of people who are talking about this subject. There are your talking heads in the film. What was that choice like? And was it, an easy one to make?
Well, it's the first time I've gotten to hand pick my team from scratch, and it's been amazing. We have, I think, 25 team members. 3 of them are men, and all the others are women. Wow. Very diverse, and yeah, just the collaborative and family nature of this filmmaking team has just been extraordinary, and how deeply committed every single member of the team is, just going above and beyond to make sure these stories get out there and have as much impact as possible. And then the historians, often studying women's history, tend to be women's historians. It's a field that was founded by women in the 1960s, and it continues to be dominated mainly by women. And some of these women historians, have written the only biographies that exist about the women that we're featuring. So they truly are the experts in the subject matters.
I also want to say that in looking at interview subjects, we really were looking for the best storytellers, the people who were the most expert. And as Charlotte said, in many instances, they happen to be women. And so initially, it wasn't so much us specifically saying we're only going to interview women. I do think that because we also wanted to have some contemporary thought leaders to be able to reflect on these women's stories and to bring them into the current context, the contemporary context, we did want to have women represent those points of view in terms of not just looking back, but looking forward as well, and giving us some perspective on the impact on current affairs. So in some ways, I can say that at one moment we kind of looked around and said, wow, this is really, I mean, not only is this a woman-led team, and not only is this a diverse team, but we're also, as Charlotte said, majority women. And I think that also the men who are part of the team are really also a joy to work with, because it is refreshing that the men who are committed to this project are as full in as the women are, and are just as excited about the content and the stories, and tell us all the time what a thrill and what a cumulative moment in their own careers working on a project like this is. So I think for us, we've been able to kind of witness the transformative nature of what these narratives can have. So we're hoping that audiences, all audiences, will feel that same way.
And what was the choice how did you go about deciding that you would focus on these 5 particular women?
Well, because it's an election year and because it's the centennial of women's vote, we wanted to focus on politicians and activists, and civil rights leaders, and we had, you know, a big pool of women to choose from, but the ways in which they shaped the American political landscape to this day, you know, just really brought them to life for us. And it was important to us also to choose women whose voice we could bring back to life. So we really went out of our way to find speeches, interviews that they gave to the press at the time that they were alive, diaries, letters, and be able to tell as much of the story as possible in their own voice. And I should mention, you know, in terms of the documentary format that we have chosen, you probably saw that we tried to bring the black and white photography to life and color by working with this very talented artist and animator who has both filled in the visual gaps, because often archive was very limited. One of the women, Jovita Idar, there's only 3 photographs available of her, portraits of her face. So how do we tell her story when we can only see her 3 times? So the artist was able to help bring her to life through art and animation. So it's a very unique visual storytelling art form that we hope will really appeal intergenerationally to youth also, who might think, you know, oh, black and white history is boring. No, we've made it really hip and exciting, and we've cut it in a very contemporary way.
Yes, the animation is really beautiful. And you mentioned Jovita Idar having less kind of material to work with. I mean, it's very, it seems important that 3 of these women happen to be women of color. And I know that documentation around people of color, particularly throughout history, tends to be kind of a little bit more difficult to pin down, and there's sometimes less to work with. Do you find any particular challenges with the others as well, with this being in comparison, I suppose, to the other women?
Well, I would say that, you know, out of the 26 women in total that we're looking at in the whole series, more than half of the women that we're focusing on are women of color. But each of these women, I guess, pose, you know, kind of different challenges in a way. I mean, we were just actually looking at a cut from a woman who was a real phenomenal African-American opera singer, who was the first woman to sing on Carnegie Hall, who apparently had the most amazing voice, could hit a high C, traveled around the world, entertained 4 presidents, royalty all around Europe. And because she was an African-American woman, her voice was never recorded. How is that possible that someone could be operating at that high of a level in their craft and there be no record of it? So I think that the one thing that we are realizing and coming squarely face to face with is, as you said, for women of color, unless there were other women of color who committed themselves to documenting those stories, we would not have a record. So we feel as if that the work we're doing really contributes to that historical record to make sure that these stories get to live on.
And could you speak a little bit more broadly about the research project process, about what it was like to go into the archives for these materials?
Charlotte?
Yes, I spent years at the New York Public Library and many different archival collections. It was so much fun. Reading biographies, creating spreadsheets to, keep track of all of these hundreds of stories. And we're actually building an interactive website that will allow people to pick their own adventure. You're interested in opera singers, you can dig into that world. You're interested in politicians, you can look at all the politicians. So we hope it will become a collection of hundreds and growing collection of stories of women from this era.
And are there any plans to get this into curriculum or to get it in front of younger female audiences?
We do have part of our charge is we are actually creating an educational curriculum for all 26 women we're featuring in Unladylike 2020. And in addition to which, there are 4 themed curriculum around women's suffrage, women in STEM, women in labor and civil rights. So that all of these, so that's 26 plus 4, so there'll be 30 specific Unladylike 2020 curriculum available for free on the PBS Public Learning Media website. So part of our mission was not just, well, all of these films will be available on the American Masters website, on the Unladylike 2020 website, on the PBS website, basically in perpetuity, so that people will always have access to them. But we wanted to make sure there was a long tail to this project. So having the educational curriculum available and really helping to change the way history is taught and what is taught was also a very important part of what we wanted to accomplish. So as Charlotte said, we wanted to make sure that people understand how exciting history is and how exciting these stories are. And I think that what helps history come to life is not so much looking at the historical timeposts in terms of the dates, but also hearing the human stories in terms of this is what these people did to make this happen, and this is how people were absolutely and genuinely and authentically impacted.
Wow, that's wonderful. And you mentioned the website and the curriculum. Are there any other websites or organizations people can follow to keep on top of this project?
Well, we've created partnerships with women's and girls organizations, historical societies, women's halls of fame, museums, and of course, public television stations all over the country. And we had a very ambitious community engagement campaign planned to have events nationwide and specifically in the communities that these women hail from. And sadly, that has now pivoted into the digital space. So we're trying to turn those events into virtual events. And you can find out about them on the website, unladylike2020.com. But because these are very evergreen stories, we hope that they will live on long beyond 2020.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much for being with us and for having your film in our festival. We're so pleased to be able to present it.
Thank you so much.
Malin, we both have attended AFI DOC festivals, have enjoyed the material that we've been exposed to as a result. So it's really a great honor to actually be a part of it. So thank you very much for letting our voices be heard and allowing people to hear more about Unladylike 2020. And please check us out on unladylike2020.com.
Absolutely our pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.